Greetings, welcome to the Diabetic Mogul podcast. On this podcast, we will offer standard and recommended practice of not only managing your diabetes goal, but how you can get involved in advocating for proper access to healthcare and bringing opportunities within the diabetes online community. It's Tino, a patient advocate and a certified diabetes educator.
I'm Hona. I'm a recently graduated medical doctor. Together, we want to raise awareness, open a discussion about diabetes, share ideas, thoughts, different perspectives, and overall create a safe environment for everyone who needs to express his or her thoughts.
We'll be hosting a series of podcast episodes from people living with diabetes, caregivers, healthcare providers, researchers, and we encourage you to get involved, get engaged, and come up together to create the change that we need. Welcome to the Diabetic Mogul podcast, Renza and Tom. The first thing would be for you to introduce yourselves.
Fantastic. Tino, it's so great to be here. My name's Renza Scibilia. I'm from Melbourne, Australia. I have lived with diabetes for 25 years now. I ticked over that milestone on Saturday this week. I work with the Global Access team at JDRF. I joined earlier this year, and I'm just so honoured and delighted to be part of this important work with Tom and the team. I've worked in diabetes advocacy now for over 20 years. Really believe that the community is just everything. Working with people in the community to see the incredible things that they're doing to improve lives of people with diabetes and connect and support each other is an absolute joy and privilege that I get to do every single day. So thanks for having me here. I'm delighted to chat with you.
My name's Tom Robinson. I don't live with diabetes, but I do live with autoimmune condition that I have to treat multiple times a day. And if I do it, I live really healthily and well. And if I don't, I get really sick really quickly. That's actually what kind of interrupted what was a career in management consulting with a group called the Boston Consulting Group. I was there for about 9-10 years. When I got really sick, finally was diagnosed after a good solid year and was able to start feeling like there was a future again. I started looking for a future where I could make a difference that really mattered. And it was right around that time that JDRF was starting to think about global access work. And I'd volunteered for JDRF for many years. In fact, had a stint working at JDRF earlier in my career as part of like a BCG fellowship. And so when I heard about those opportunities, I thought, this is where I'm supposed to go next. And so I got involved in the global access work right back at the start in about 2019. I just got to say, it feels an immense privilege to be able to work on something so important. I just hope I can do a job that honors the trust and the commitment and the opportunity. And I feel really privileged to get a chance to come here and speak with you, Tino, and your podcast listeners. The only way we get this sort of stuff done is through and with the community. What an extraordinary community to be a part of and to have been welcomed into. So thanks for having me today.
It's an honor for me to have you both coming onto this podcast with your expertise and everything, connection to diabetes with the work that you are doing, which is fantastic. And to Renza, congratulations, 25th anniversary. And as I was just doing sort of like a background check, of course I do know you. Everybody knows you in the diabetes community. But also I had to go and check on your LinkedIn. And what I saw was, feels like since you got diagnosed, that's when you got involved in advocacy, working with diabetes communities in Australia. And you have a strong admiration for the diabetes community. So what are your greatest takeaways from your role as the community leader within the diabetes space?
Oh, that's such a great question. And I think that when people ask me why I stumbled into a job working in diabetes. It was going to be like a 6-month stint, 21, 22 years later, here we are. But I think the biggest takeaway for me is that we are really stronger as a community. Individuals with diabetes are stronger when they have connections with others with diabetes. And I guess that's sort of been the driving force between what I've tried to do is to forge those connections selfishly for myself. That's very much where I write a blog and people said, why did you start blogging? I started blogging because I thought, well, maybe someone might reach out to me and I can connect with other people with diabetes. It's always been the purpose behind what I've done. So my takeaway, I guess, is finding your place in community and connecting with people, doing what you can to support your own community is just such a joy. And, I can't imagine living as well as I have with diabetes if I didn't have that community around me and didn't work and play in that community, if you like. So my biggest takeaway is get in there and find your people and work with them in any way you can.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. That's a great response ever. We learn from you with all that you do, supporting each other to say, like, when someone does something, you also have to support to make sure other people can see your network and actually see what this someone is doing. So great. So now maybe we go on to Tom. Tom, if you may describe a day in the life of the Vice President of Global Access at JDRF International, that would be great.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I suppose the day typically starts around about 4 or 5 a.m., getting up. One of the first things I try and do every day is, you might have seen this, I keep talking about, the people who go missing from type 1 diabetes. And one of the first things I do every day is I pull up those numbers and just think about, okay, what are the top priorities for what we need to do to make that sure that doesn't happen? And just try and really start from that every single day. From about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, that's usually when the first calls with America start. And you sort of spend a bunch of time talking to people in North and South Americas and connecting with them. Sometimes people staying up very late in Europe or Africa. And then there's a little bit of a break in the middle of the day where you get to sit down and do some work yourself. And often that's things like writing policy submission to a government using the index data, or thinking about, hey, what's missing from the index data? Renza and I've had all these great conversations about things that matter to the community that we aren't counting yet. And so, okay, well, what can we do to try and start counting those things, and making sure that this can become in time truly representative of the concerns of the community. We'll have, during that kind of working phase of the day, there'll be a chance to kind of catch up with some people who are doing great work. Renza's sort of thinking about what's the best way for us to play a role in supporting the community and its work around the world. You got people like Priyanka doing this fantastic work in India, trying to support the community there as they advocate for better care. And boy, are they having some successes. Like, it's a really exciting place to be a part of. We have this genius, Faye, who's our senior data scientist, and he's like working on a bunch of things, including, the next version of the index, but also like his background's in artificial intelligence. So with all these tools that are out, he's thinking about how can we like streamline and automate work using these AIs, help us do more faster. By 3 o'clock, I'll be on the phone with Faye, and he'll ask me all these incredibly difficult technical questions. So that's when I usually have, 2 or 3 coffees to try and like get the brain powered again. Often in the evenings, there's 1 or 2 calls that will be with, fantastic collaborators in India or Europe or Africa or the Middle East. And that's kind of the window to get a chance to talk with them, and people are doing really exciting things. I think last week, for example, a lot of those calls were about people who are currently involved in the funding space, and they're funding access for type 1 in specific locations. And there's a few players across the Middle East and Europe who are doing that. Last week, I was having conversations with them about like, how can we get together and really write a shared strategy for doing this? Like one that sort of is a little bit like how I started my day. Starts with, hey, here are all the people that we want to help. Here are the big numbers that we want to make as small as possible of missing people and of years lost. How can we coordinate really effectively and come together as a community, eliminate duplicating work, to move faster, to bring others into the space as funders, and to frankly share intelligence that we spend as effectively as possible? And I think really one of the interesting questions that we spend a lot of time talking about is how distinctive type 1 diabetes is, where we do have something that's quite unusual compared to a lot of other public health issues. That is the incredible work the community does, which changes lives every day, and does it in these ways that, frankly, we need to think about how do we sustain it and scale it up and support you all to do more of what you do. But to be honest, also just to give profile, the stories of what the type 1 community does need to be heard elsewhere in the world in other conditions too, because it's brilliant, it's inspiring, and I think it's going to be part of how we solve some of the great health challenges that we face as a human species over the coming decades. And so that's kind of how I finished my day. And I go, oh, geez, I'm really fired up and excited right now. At the moment, I'm binging Breaking Bad to try and take the temperature off and get to sleep afterwards.
Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Vice President. It is a great honor to have the director and the vice president on the podcast. Briefly, just share with us. I think people have been seeing this a lot. T1D Index. They don't know what it is. Who is involved? How many organizations are involved? Is it just JDRF? What is it like really? What can you share for the audience to know about the T1D Index?
I'll tell you about when I first really learnt about the index. Let me talk to you about it where I see the community just benefiting from it. And then, so this is probably backtracking. We're doing it the reverse way, I guess. But I got really excited when I learnt about this index, because the first thing that I thought was, wow, we've never had this. We have never had global data about type 1 diabetes. So every year the IDF puts out their atlas, which is a really important piece of work that takes a snapshot of what diabetes landscape is, but it hasn't collated type 1 diabetes information beyond the age of 20. I'm well beyond the age of 20, as are significantly, the vast majority of people living with type 1 diabetes. So suddenly we had this index being built that was going to do that. It was going to provide that data of, where are those numbers? But more than that, it was going to look at, well, where are the people who are missing? Where are the people whose lives sadly have been cut short and devastatingly short because of type 1 diabetes? And that could be because they weren't diagnosed, because there's no treatment, there's no access, whatever. There are a multitude of reasons that need addressing there. I was totally blown away when I thought about what it was that was going to be all in one web, sort of one site. Because what I saw and what I could see was that this was the most incredible opportunity for the community to use as an advocacy tool, to tell the story of diabetes. Now, I am all about storytelling. I am all about the narrative of life with diabetes, but it's also about how we improve life with diabetes. And we can only do that when we can measure it, right? When we're able to say, look, we should have more whatever it is, and look at what's happening in places where they do have better access to technology, where they do have better diagnosis because people know what they're looking for. For me to be able to point to something and see something and grasp something that has all of that information, so I could say, look at what's happening in this community, and being able to work with community members to say, here's the story that you can tell when you are lobbying and advocating and speaking about this and creating the story of diabetes in your country. We suddenly had that, and we'd never had that before. Absolutely, we had incredible advocates from around the world telling their stories, which is so important. But and Tino and Tom, you would have heard me talk about this, the hearts and minds things. We have the hearts stories. We want to keep hearing those, but we need to understand what that means with the mind stuff, the numbers, the data. And this brings all of that together. So that's, for me, was the community benefit of this was just so huge. And we're already seeing that. We're already seeing how the community has just jumped on board to use this in such a meaningful way. And there's so much more that we can do with it. But to have all of that information there, available, easily accessible in ways that can be presented so neatly, so concisely, and tell the story so incredibly powerfully, I think is remarkable.
I think everyone's got their own story of how the index started. And that's because it's not just one person's thing. What has happened is that I think people have recognized the need for this sort of information to, especially at this time when data is the language of business and policy, we needed that toolkit for our arsenal for advocacy. And I remember a lot of people working on it, and then a lot of those groups came together to work together in a really seamless, easy way. I've had a bunch of people actually ask me, how did you manage to get all these different groups working together? And it's it wasn't hard. They all had this sense, this is what's needed. It's for the good of the community. I'm going to offer up to you 20 years of research I've been doing. I'm going to offer up to you hundreds of hours of my time on a volunteer basis. There's this incredible generosity of spirit that was shocking to live through as people kind of banded together and started sharing work they'd done previously. And for me personally, I was brought into this by a guy called Mike Wilson, whose day job is the CEO of JDRF Australia. But he was a guy who spent, I think he interviewed about 150 people asking, hey, what's needed? If JDRF did some more global work, what's needed? What would you want them to do? And one of the three answers everyone said was, hey, we need more of this data. Of course, a number of people he spoke to said, we need more of this data, but I've got some for you that we could potentially share. And so then you had people like Graham Ogle and Gabriel Gregory from Life for a Child. They had this incredible modeling they'd been doing in some of the countries where they operated, trying to estimate how many people had type 1 and how well they lived with type 1 and what sort of a difference it made if you made sure they had test strips, for example. I can remember Gabriel Gregory and Graham and I having a conversation where it was just before Christmas, just before Gabriel went off on a trip. I said, look, could you extend that to be more global? Could you do it to other countries? And could you add in these other features? And Gabriel was like, let me see what I can do. I've got a week. And he didn't sleep for a week. The guy worked something like 100 hours. And when I met him at the end of the week, he had built the very first draft of the index model. incredible, like just an incredible effort. But he wanted us to have it before he went off on his trip so that we could keep working on it. Like he had that commitment. And then others came in. A lot of the brilliant academics and people who are part of the IDF's Atlas structures. They have a number of committees with really smart epidemiologists on them. So people like Dana Magliano, Ronald Marr, and so forth, Stephen Colagiuri, all kind of came in and said, yeah, like we've been assessing incident studies and other things for, I think at that point, 20 years, and looking at which ones are good and which ones maybe don't quite make the cut. And we can give you all of that. Take that, start using it. And then they all got really involved in actually thinking about how to do the work, do the intellectual work of trying to create the best possible estimates from the index that you could. But they weren't alone. We're really lucky to have ISPAD join in. Obviously, it's an international society of predominantly pediatric endocrinologists and kind of allied healthcare professionals. And they really rolled up their sleeves. I remember Kim Donahue, who was the president at the time of ISPAD, saying, hey, what if we did a survey of doctors around the world? Would that be useful? And I'm like, would that be? Yeah, I could imagine that being useful. Like, let's find out some stuff. We sat down and wrote a survey kind of thinking about questions that we're desperate to get answers to that maybe these doctors would have perspective on, having hundreds of people living with type 1 and so forth. And I remember just talking to survey experts as we were designing this and them being really skeptical, saying, look, you got to be prepared, Tom, like you probably get 40 or 50 responses to this survey. Probably not going to be useful to you. Don't rely on this. But those experts didn't really understand just who we were dealing with. The survey went out on the newsletter to the ISPAD members. And sure enough, we got 40 or 50 responses. Like the experts were right in that regard. But then Kim got on the phone and Corinne de Beaufort, who was the next president-elect, got on the phone, and others from the ISPAD executive got on the phone and started talking to their colleagues everywhere around the world and say, hey, can you do this survey? Can you get 10 other doctors in your country to do this survey? We ended up with 550, almost 600 responses, which allowed us, amongst many other things, but one of the key things that allowed us to do is to establish for the first time, to put some numbers behind the problem of non-diagnosis and how many were going undiagnosed and dying at onset, which until that day had been a story that was told, but not a story that had been measured. And from that day, we were able to say, look, it is at least 30 or 40,000 people under 25 a year who are dying undiagnosed, and quite probably more, but at least that, because 550 doctors from around the world told us that about their own practices. So now we've been able to bring new capital into the space to try and do some more things to solve those issues. So long story short, I'm just listing out some of the people who participated. I'm really not doing credit to the full list. The full list is too long for this podcast. I'm thinking here, Renza, but you got Renza so involved fairly early on and sat down and kind of really helped us think through like some of what ought to be involved, but also like some of the things that you ought to measure and how to measure them. A lot of the epidemiology was shaped by your advice, but then also by the people you put us in touch with and their advice. The concept of missing people is not an epidemiological concept usually measured. It's one that came out of a mother saying, I miss my child. They would be 40 today. I celebrate their birthday every year still. And we said, oh, geez, like we have to measure that. Same with the concept of measuring years of life lost. Like that's not completely alien to epidemiology, but we wanted to do it in a way that sort of started to add up things like time spent in treatment, all the finger pricks, but also then look at complications and also look at life, like try and bring everything together. And that came out of people telling us like, it's so hard to talk about diabetes because it is so many things and it's really hard to communicate. So maybe if we can create one number that's all the things and really kind of gives it its gravity and due, maybe that would be helpful. I'll close by, I do really want to rabbit on, give so many people credit, but it really it had many fathers and mothers. I'll say that as closing.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for that response, and also even for giving credits to so many people who had a huge contribution to this. In the community, we say there's nothing about us without us, and of course, it was just amazing to get people involved, people who are already doing this work. For example, ISPAD focuses mostly on children and adolescents, which is typically people living with type 1 diabetes. Speaking about how this T1D index was developed, because I know in the developed countries, like say UK, Australia, usually they would have accurate statistics on the number of people living with diabetes. But in low to mid-income countries, usually we do not have these. People are really interested. We want to know really how the T1D index was developed, or even how it is going to be improved like over time. I will need both your response on this. What's your take?
I'll try and answer briefly so you can ask follow-up questions here because it's a complex topic. What I'll say is this: I think 75% of the people in the world live in a country where there has been some study of type 1 diabetes incidence. So we use those data points to sort of say, okay, well, that might be representative of the incidence of type 1 in that country, but it also might not. A lot of those studies are older. If you have a study from the 1990s that says that incidence is 3.2 per 100,000, there's a very good chance that the incidence has grown since then. That's one of the things we did, is we looked at what those growth curves typically look like in different clusters of countries and applied them to older studies, so that that 3.8 might become 7.2 by today, for example. We actually then sort of also try to work backwards and say what might incidence have been previously. All of that's really imperfect, right? You're filling in the blanks before and after the incidence study with a guess as to how the incidence might have changed over time. A second thing that we had to do was look at 25% of people, of course, live in countries that don't have any incidence studies whatsoever. And so what do you do there? Do you just not count them? That seemed like the wrong answer. Do you not try and estimate them? That seemed wrong. So what we did is we actually followed a method the IDF has been using a long time for its atlas, where their committee has spent a lot of time thinking about, okay, this country looks a little bit like these other countries. We'll use those other countries' incidence study as a proxy in this country. They used that a good 15 years, I think, before we started using it. It's not perfect, right? It's a long way from perfect, but it's something that serious epidemiologists have spent a lot of time thinking about. And so we said, okay, well, for our first version, let's try using that. There are a number of countries where we will borrow data from across the border and extend it in that way. For example, if we don't have data from Iraq, we might borrow it from a few of its neighboring countries. And so that was how we managed to get some data for different countries where we didn't have the incidence. And then the last kind of really tricky thing we had to solve was, what about adults? So much of the incidence data that gets measured is for people in pediatric populations, under 20, under 25, something like that. One of those options, often under 15. So what about adults? We know that there's a lot of incidence amongst adults. So for that, we actually got hands on. There was a fantastic working group at the IDF that had already gone through and looked at every single adult incidence study and pulled them together and updated the meta-analysis there. And they'd actually gone through and graded them. And they graded them based on how good the diagnostic apparatus was in the country where the study took place. So like how good were they at diagnosing adults? So if they routinely test autoantibodies and things like that when they're diagnosing adult diabetes, then that's quite good. But if they just run purely off clinical impression, then that's not quite as good. And so they had I think a 4-tier scale. And we actually took those two groups of studies and broke them in two and analyzed them separately and found this really fascinating thing, which was that in the places that had kind of more lower rated diagnostic for adults, there was this curve where you had a pediatric peak around 10 to 14 with the highest incidence rate, and then a gradual decline throughout your lifetime until by your 70s or 80s, very few people are developing type 1. So that's the low quality studies. And then the high quality studies showed a completely different picture. Where diagnosis of adults is really good, you see a pediatric peak, and then it comes back down again, and then it stays flat rather than declining. In later adulthood, it starts going back up again. So in your 50s, 60s, 70s, your chances of developing type 1 increased in those higher quality studies. So we use the higher quality studies as an estimate of the true incidence over a lifetime, but the lower quality studies as an estimate of, I guess, how many people might be misdiagnosed with type 2 instead of type 1. So those were three of the things that we used to kind of fill in blanks. And of course, when you do stuff like that, you make your model more complex and you potentially affect its accuracy. It's quite a challenging thing that we kept pushing ourselves to do, to say, okay, we don't want to come back without at least an estimate for some of these things. We want to have numbers that we can use, even if they've got significant bars of uncertainty around them. We need something, right? Just because it's dark and difficult to see and it's raining, doesn't mean you don't look at the oncoming train. We had to take a look, but we did as well also test along the way how well the model predicts reality. And we had quite a few good registries in rich countries that you could look at and say, okay, well, it's quite close, 5% off on average amongst rich countries from the prevalence data. All of those techniques I just described work pretty well if you've got good data like you do in rich countries. And then in kind of lower income settings, we saw it become less accurate, but still not terrible. And for example, there's reasonable data on prevalence in Mali, for example, and our numbers came out relatively close. I think we were a little bit low because we hadn't factored in the effect of Santa Diabetes intervention there, but we still came out close within a reasonable margin of error in that country. The model's wrong, but it's not bad. It's at least directionally correct. And so you can derive good insights from it and useful insights from it. So we said, look, let's publish it. Let's release this to the world. I'll stop. I can tell you about some of the feedback we've gotten since then if you're interested.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. Renza, would you want to add something?
want to pick up what happened when the index was launched. And I love telling this story. It was launched during EASD last year. And I knew that it was being launched because I'd bumped into somebody who works with JDRF, Jeanette, and she'd said, it's happening today, it's happening today. I'd spoken with Tom, I don't know how many times, and some of the team in the lead up to this. And I was so curious to see what the response was going to be from people. I've told Tom and the team this, that there was this moment at EASD where I was walking through big hall. People were frozen. They were just stopped with their phones and just staring at their phones because everybody had got an alert that this had happened and everyone was telling everyone else and sharing this. And obviously everybody went to their country. That was the first thing people did, right? They went to their country, looked at the data. All the diabetes advocates who were at EASD shared it straight away right across their socials. But what I was hearing from people was, look at what this is telling us. This is not good enough, because suddenly we had, in this very clear way, we could compare. As somebody living in Australia, I could see what outcomes for people with diabetes in Australia were, but I could then compare it with somebody in Mali, with somebody in India. And people were doing that. Straight away, people were saying, we always knew this was an issue. You know, we know Life for a Child, we know Insulin for Life, we read their newsletters, we see what they're doing and the incredible work and the important work, the stories they tell. But it had never been, the data had never been shown in a way that was just so clear. And the story was damning. It was astounding. It was quite shattering. I think that that's one of the things that, you know, I'm not a data person, but I am a storyteller. When you can use data to tell stories in a way that makes people sit up and listen and say, okay, now I get it. We have huge potential now. We know what the problem is. We can see how huge it is. We can measure it. But now we can actually really do something about it because we've got the numbers behind it. Tino, you know what we say in the diabetes community. Diabetes isn't all about numbers, but actually sometimes numbers are incredibly helpful because they help tell the story. We've got that now. We've got this in a way that's really meaningful. And the thing that, you know, I've learnt in the short time that I've been working with the Global Access team is that there is always more to do and how we can improve things and other things we can measure. And I love that. I love the fact that there's going to be more that we can measure, and it will be those things that are important to people with diabetes, things that we talk about. I mean, already being able to measure the time that we and see the time that we spend doing diabetes, we know how significant that is. But being able to tell those stories using numbers is so valuable and so powerful. When I am talking about diabetes now, and when any of us as advocates are doing that, we have this incredible resource to use, and it's easily accessible and it's easily understood, and you can move it around to use the bits that you really want to hone in on. It is so valuable to us to be able to do that in our storytelling.
Renza, can I just offer one comment on what you just said, which is, I feel like it really struck me personally. There's a danger with these sorts of numbers where people become statistics. There are so many reasons to say diabetes is not about the numbers, and that's one of them. And I think reflexive pausing we often do when we're inside the team talking about, okay, let's just stop and think about who we're thinking about here is really an important discipline to go, no, these are people, not numbers. I think there's also the opportunity in the numbers as well as that they do tell the story for people to have the voice to tell their own story.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the real value. That's why we take the risk of the danger, because of that benefit of giving voice to the voiceless.
And I think also the way that there was a lot that really drew me to this work before I started working in the team. And part of that was the fact that I'm all about language, right? And at no time were people talking about these statistics as if there weren't people very much behind it. And I think even that's seen in the way that of how sensitively this is presented. It doesn't read like a research paper that is, because of the nature of the way that research is written, as very methodical and very factual, and that's it. Of course it is all of those things, but at no point does it not remember that every one of those hours that is lost, that is an hour that a person living with diabetes has lost. Every single hour that we can give back is an hour of life that we get back. that is central to this. It's so clear in how this is presented, and the stories throughout it are very, very clear. When I say nothing about us without us, it's very clear that, I think I said this when I was telling people that I was joining this team, was nothing about us without us runs very deep through the role that I'm doing, but it's not just my work. It's right across the whole team. That's astonishing. It's just so incredible to be part of that and to see it in the work that's coming from the team.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your contributions, making sure that if this person says this and you feel like we still need to add more, you'd jump in and just address that. So thank you so much. That is brilliant and amazing. Of course, the audience is going to appreciate it. Yes, it goes without saying, data is very critical. And for so many people living in the low to middle income countries, or people in communities where there is no data at all, it's a bit tricky for them to use those as pressure points. So maybe I wanted to ask from you, knowing how important data is and how you are putting it out there so that other people can actually use it. If you could kindly break down how diabetes advocates or any health advocate can use like this simulation tool as a pressure point to their policymakers.
Oh boy. I feel like in so many ways, I feel like one of the really exciting ways, let's start personal. Right at the personal individual level, I've heard of people using the numbers to advocate to their doctors for better care, like directly. You see things in the data like, every extra test strip that you get to use adds 4 hours to my life, or every time I change my sensor, I add 40 hours to my life. I've heard of people saying, hey, give me more test strips, or going to their local pharmacy and say, you're out of stock. That's not okay, because that packet of 50 is worth 200 hours. Like, you've got to make sure you get them in next month and every month. And I think that kind of really kind of personal level of advocacy is actually tremendously powerful, right? The force of an informed group of people living with diabetes, the power to advocate for themselves within healthcare is really critical. I love that. I think there's also like a click further out where I've seen the data being used to, I guess, mobilize groups of advocates together. I think that's a really powerful thing too. For example, I've been talking to our community in Brazil, and they've been saying like, here's a whole bunch of things that I'm interested to advocate for. Can we talk about like how impactful these things might be, and think about which ones to prioritize and how we can tell that story to government or to municipal governments or to industry in a really powerful way. So there's kind of like this role that can play in the formation of a group that's got a particular cause to advocate for. And I think that's a second really interesting thing that's valuable. And if you or anyone, if your listeners are interested in that, like, reach out to us. Faye's a genius. He'll get on the phone with you and he'll like help sift through things, help answer questions, but also help identify places where we don't have answers to questions. You just need to use your judgment. And like, they're really good discussions. We've been having them with dozens of different groups. So that's the second thing, kind of a little bit further out from the personal. And then if you kind of broaden the aperture a little further, I think there's a powerful role to play advocacy to governments. The community in India, for example, both, and when I say community, I include both healthcare practitioners and people with diabetes. Like, we're one big community, right? We've got shared goals. That community has been doing a really effective job using the data, using the examples of what works to make the case to both state and central governments in India that care ought to be improved, and they're listening. I think we've seen Rajasthan announce recently they want to provide pump to pediatric patients. It's the language they use, but provide pumps to children with type 1. That's fantastic. We'll see more such announcements coming in future, I'm sure. So there's that kind of government advocacy piece. Particularly useful, I think, from the index is that we get to talk about lifetimes and the whole experience of type 1, whereas a lot of what has existed previously has been a bit more kind of year by year. The things that get measured are determined by doctors and health economists, right, rather than the community. And being able to shift the conversation to what actually matters to us, to this community, and what that looks like over a whole life, not just in a single year, I think makes it much more powerful. Like, the case becomes stronger, and you can reach out to political leaders and decision makers who otherwise might not have felt as involved. So that's a broadening of the aperture. And then my last one would be to go, these are just mine that I've seen, right? I'm sure I'll hear of dozens of other ways. The last one that I've seen really, really used for is kind of at a strategic kind of Gates Foundation level to sort of say, hey, like, let's look at the whole problem of type 1 diabetes and start thinking about how we can break down the burden in different chunks that we can address one by one. All the work we're all doing as a very complex global community, we can each fit in and go, okay, my bit's this bit, I'm going to solve that. And your bit's this bit, and you're going to solve that. And I think that's really interesting because it starts creating connections where it's like, oh, actually, there's like 5 people working on this bit. We should get them all together. Like, some of them have got brilliant ideas that the others don't have, and vice versa. We can kind of start learning from each other and collaborating in ways that we might not have thought of previously. But also because it starts to give you this sort of, if I talk to a billionaire now, I can say things like, hey, this is what it takes. We need this many millions of dollars to do this thing, which we couldn't say previously. And I think that kind of last level of advocacy is in some ways the one that's moving fastest at the moment. So those have been my 4 advocacy rings that are how I think about it.
Yeah, and I think that it is also where I'm seeing it as well is in the narratives that people are telling. If you look at what people are saying in the community, whether it be in blog posts or on podcasts or whatever it is, they're talking about that whole spectrum. This is what it means to me, and this is how I can measure my life in this way. But imagine if in my community we had access to this, what that would mean. And that's something that's really useful, having that really useful if you're talking to the media, instead of just being able to say, look, for me, this is really important, but being able to say, look, this is what this is going to mean in our local community or in our state or in our country or wherever it is. So seeing people being able to take the data and then put the personal story on it to explain what it means in a way that becomes it makes sense to people because it's really about people. It's very easy to do that. So all of those things, but it is the personal advocacy that I'm hearing stories about as well. People say, I went and spoke with my health professional and I said, I really need more access to this, and look at what that will mean in a way that you can measure. They've had real success in that. Whereas before, going in and saying, look, I really want this because I think it's going to make my life easier. I absolutely think that should be enough, but unfortunately, sometimes it's not. So being able to have extra data points and extra information to be able to really put your case forward. I mean, how incredible is that? That's just so great that people with diabetes can do that. And I think that that's part of the thing that we have to keep doing is having workshops and talking about this and really pointing out about how it can be used on that individual level as well as in a broader sense as well.
I was just nodding. So thank you so much. I'm speechless too. I don't have words. Thank you for your amazing, amazing contribution, both of you. Basing from your experiences, from your work, things that you do and the things that you're doing already, like what are some of the ways that we as the community can help to change the way or the story for people living with diabetes across the world?
Oh, I love that question so much. I feel like there's no one answer to that, because what people with diabetes want to need out of their advocacy efforts will always vary, which is fine. But I think what I would say to the community is that this tool was developed for and by the community. And if we talk about the diabetes community as being so including and encompassing everybody who has anything to do with diabetes, from health professionals, researchers, people with diabetes, loved ones of people with diabetes organizations, decision makers, all of this is something that brings everyone together. There's really very few instances that you can point to that true collaboration and celebration of the community. But I would say to people to use it however they see is going to be the most powerful for them. But at any time to work together around that. Community groups are just so wonderful at supporting each other and sharing ideas. And you sit there with somebody, and I've had these conversations with people who have said, this is what I got out of the index when I first looked at it. And I thought, wow, that is so obvious. And yet it's not something that I sort of jumped at straight away. So I think having conversations with others about just how powerful this is for their own needs is really useful. And come and talk to us, because I feel that I'm always speaking with people from the community and people love to talk to me about this. But if there's anything that you think, I would really love it if there was a way to see this, who knows, there might be. We would love to hear what it is that people are saying that they feel is missing from here. Because as Tom said, one of the things that we're really excited about doing is measuring the things that are important to people with diabetes. And we already do that, but we talk about mental health. We talk about those impacts of diabetes, about that real burden of diabetes. diabetes. How do we get that across in a way so that we've got data to really support what people are saying around that as well? And what is it exactly? What are the bits in particular that are really important that you see represented in a way that help you tell your story? I think that we have seen the global diabetes community embrace this and that only ever happens when there's something that is meaningful, important to the community. And clearly this is. And a big part of that is, I think I can take absolutely no credit for what it is that's been delivered because I was not in any way part of the team back then. But I do know that there were lots of people with diabetes involved in that and the community involved in that. And so I feel like that's one of the reasons there's a confidence from the community that what they see in front of them is very representative of the community of people with diabetes. Keep talking to us. That's what I'm there for, is to continue to forge the links that the team's already made, work together to make sure that we're getting this information out there as broadly as possible and changing lives and changing the story, changing the numbers.
Renza, I just want to echo a couple of the points you made. I don't have anything more insightful to say than what you did, but I just want to back up a couple of them because they're such important points. One of them being, I do think we're going to find out. I'm almost reluctant to say anything in response to this question because the community is so innovative and clever, and like, you all know what your concerns are and you all know what tactics might work. I would hate to try and prescribe to anybody what to do with the data because I would hate to stifle that genius. This is a community where the community invented Midi Zindagi and kind of this incredible delivery of care to remote parts of Pakistan. Communities there in Ahmedabad, essentially running the healthcare system and inviting doctors to be part of it part-time. The community is doing rights-based advocacy in Brazil, where there's enough in the constitution and in legislation that you can actually sue your local government to do more and do better. The community invented looping and refused to wait. The community founded JDRF. We've funded $3 billion of healthcare research since, of type 1 diabetes specifically research since. Almost twice as much again with leverage of people who've co-invested alongside. All this has come out of the community. So who am I to dare say what ought to be done? But I really want to encourage two conversations, at least, where you can explore how the data might be relevant. One is to have the conversation, with your local community and say, hey, let's look at the numbers. Do they help highlight the things that we care about? Is the 4 hours per test strip a useful number for us? Or does it not? Does it not do things that we need? In which case, geez, get on the phone with us. There's been a few people who've come to us and said, I'd love a number that can do this. We've started creating them. In the US, we've had some advocates reach out saying, I'd love to know how much every dollar on research is worth. What's the impact of that? We've started quantifying that. We'll probably release it publicly sometime soon, 6 months maybe, but we've started working on that. And it's actually really fascinating that we can use the index to simulate having the research and not having the research and how much life that money has given back to the community. That's really incredible. But that came out of an ask. In New Zealand, we had an ask, can we look at the total lifetime costs with CGMs and with multiple daily injections so we can make the case more effectively for CGMs? And we've started quantifying that. And it's a really interesting number and one that strongly favors a higher standard of care. So that's the first thing. Please have the conversation. Does this represent concern? Does this represent us? We've tried our very best to do that, and we know there are gaps already with things we just didn't have time to do in version 1. We're working on version 2. We're doing ad hoc stuff along the way to help people out. Reach out to us, have that conversation with us. We'd love. This is your table. Invite us to it. Invite us to the table. Let's have a conversation about making sure these numbers tell your story. And then the second is, how can we use these numbers in targeting decision makers or just doing it ourselves? How can we use these numbers and put them to use to achieve those goals? And are they useful there? And I think they are in some ways, but we still got a lot of work to do. Behind the scenes, again, we've had requests can you help us quantify some of the different care models that are out there so that I can know which one's the most cost effective to put my donation toward? That's a query we've had from a few people. I'm hoping at some point we'll have some fairly robust work that we can start to publish on that so that everyone can see how things are going. That's just one example of people taking action and again, kind of reaching out to us and inviting us to their table to be part of the conversation. Please do. I think this is the first version of the index. We've built it together. I think that as a global type 1 community, we're going to build the second one together and the third, and we're going to keep doing it until we have all the data we need and until the burden of type 1 diabetes has been lifted. We want back every single day that's currently being lost to the condition. It's not a case of we can't do this without you. It's a case of we want to come to your table where you are doing this and see if we can help. Reach out to Renza. She's fantastic at being our front end, and then we'll have that conversation together.
I love it how you put it all together. Thank you so much. I think maybe the last thing that I'll ask, you could maybe give us your last words to the audience. It doesn't have to be about T1D Index, anything.
All right, let me say this. Tina, I'm going to turn this right back on you. I frequently refer to you as the hardest working advocate in diabetes because you're everywhere. I'm just going to say that this work is so founded in the community, about the diabetes community. This wasn't a case of build it and they will come, because we were already all together building it. So keep working with us on this and getting us across the line and working with people like Tina. And thank you for being such a champion of this work and everything else, and being such an incredible support to what's going on in the community. You know, that's my thing that I always say. People that I love to work with are the people who just want to keep building people up and sharing information and getting it out there and putting it in the hands of people. So thank you, Tina, for giving us an opportunity here to do that. Keep finding those people. They're the people that we love to work with as well. Yeah, let's just keep working to change those numbers. I feel that hope is such an important thing that we have in our community. I have it personally as a person living with diabetes. I need to have it. I've had it every day for 25 years, but it is an ever-present force, I think, in our community. And so let's just keep building on that and using that to propel us, I guess, as we move forward to really change lives of people with type 1 diabetes.
Beautifully put. Rather than try and follow that up with any last words of my own, I want to just close with a question actually to you, Tino, which is, you invited us here. Thanks so much. Like, it's an honor to be part of this conversation and to have this conversation with you and your listeners. Why? Why did you invite us here? What are you hoping we might be able to say? What would delight you? That's my question, my closing question.
That's a great question. Yes, in the diabetes community, we say there's nothing about us without us, and we are stronger together. We are trying to build each other so that some people might not have access to the thing that I have access to. So I'm trying to pass on the light so that they may have all these things. The other thing is, why I'm doing this is we have a lot of unmet needs. Some of the things that people might feel they are not met yet, probably it's already been addressed, it's already out there, but they may not have access to it. So this is just me trying to level up the ground with the access that I have, with the people at my disposal, because I believe I'm a people person. I love to encourage people, inspire people, educate, and with all that is at my disposal, and find out how other people can actually benefit from this.
That is fantastic stuff, mate. Any ways that we can help you, please let us know. It's just such brilliant work you're doing.
Thank you so much, Renza, for the beautiful words. So thank you so much for all the opportunities and everything and every shout out. With your support, having you here together in this morning, it's an honor for me. Thank you so much for gracing this podcast channel with your presence and your brilliant minds. I cannot thank you enough.